Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Canada West Foundation's program today. I think you're going to really enjoy the guest that we have on this morning's webinar. We've got the Honorable Ed Stelmach, the Honorable Gary Doer, the Honorable Erin O'Toole, and the Honorable Christy Clark to talk about their experiences in government and in trust and in leadership. I'm not going to take too much time, except to say at Canada West Foundation, we are always striving to bring you material that is relevant and timely. And I think the subject matter of today's discussion is a relevant and timely one. I, of course, have to give the advertisement that we are a donor-driven organization. And so if you like what you see, please consider making a donation to the Canada West Foundation. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the people who are on our panel.
Morning from Ottawa. I'm Erin O'Toole, and I'm really privileged to host this session. Thank you very much to the Honorable Gary Marr, one of the Canadians who truly deserves the moniker Honorable. He's a friend to many people of all sides, of all levels of government, and Canada West Foundation is very fortunate to have such a passionate Albertan, such a passionate Canadian leading its public policy work. And this is an important session on building trust, a time where we see trust eroding in politics, in politicians, in institutions, some of which, including our parliamentary democracy, that we considered to be sort of the bedrock of what makes our society. Well, there's trust being eroded. So today we're going to talk about that and how leaders, provincial leaders, premiers deal with elements of trust and their caucus and advancing public policy for the betterment of their province and for the country. And we're very fortunate to have three distinguished Canadians with us today. I'll just quickly introduce them all. The Honorable Christy Clark was Premier of British Columbia from 2011 to 2017. Before that, she served as a member of the opposition and has a distinguished career as a public commentator and public policy thought leader. Premier Gary Doer, the Honorable Gary Doer, is Premier of Manitoba from 1999 to 2009, after which he served ably as Canada's ambassador to the United States. He has a distinguished track record in the provincial legislature and in national and international politics. And finally, the Honorable Ed Stelmach, who was Premier of Alberta from 2006 to 2011, having served as a cabinet minister in the government of Ralph Klein and been a colleague and even a seatmate to the Honorable Gary Marr. Ed Stelmach served with distinction and still contributes to public policy dialogue in Alberta and in Canada. Welcome to all three of you to this panel.
Thanks, Erin. Nice to be here.
Well, we've got great coverage, and today we're talking about trust and developing caucus trust and developing policy within a government caucus. I served in a government caucus as a member of caucus and as a cabinet minister, but never led a government caucus. We were trying to get there, but it's a different dynamic leading a government caucus to an opposition caucus. And a lot of it really is based in large part on the trust and the leadership style of the premier. So let's go around the horn, maybe starting with you, Gary. How would you describe your leadership style, not just as premier, but how you led the caucus and how you managed the diverse interests and priorities of caucus as Premier of Manitoba? And I think you're on mute, Gary.
I know better. I'm trained on these things. Thank you very much. Of course, Erin O'Toole was a wonderful Air Force personnel in Winnipeg for a period of time, a navigator, I believe. And I also had the privilege in Washington, Erin O'Toole representing Canada, when we recognized the first Special Forces team made up of Canadians and Americans, mostly from the West, that went behind enemy lines. And they finally got, 40 years later, the Congressional Medal. And Minister O'Toole represented us well. And there wasn't a dry eye in that congressional chamber that day when these people, some of them 90 years old, finally got the recognition they deserved. Mm-hmm. So I always remember that Erin, and really, really warmly. My first experience with caucus was I just got elected, and I went into the caucus room, and the government had been reelected, so there was a number of people that were already in cabinet from the previous election. And I remember noticing right away that there was kind of a two-tier kind of participation in the caucus meeting. It looked like some of the cabinet ministers had these books, the great big books that they brought in to the caucus room and plunked them down and didn't pay much attention to what the debate was going to be. It looked like tablets from Moses coming into the room from the people that were in cabinet. So I thought to myself later, if I ever have a chance to influence this, and I later was able to, we would really be working hard to establish the fact that everybody's equal, cabinet, non-cabinet, in that caucus meeting. And we would elect the caucus chair, who would sit at the head of the table. The premier would sit beside that individual, and we would try to run the caucus in an inclusive way as possible. Having said that, there is a reality that about 40%, 35 or 40% of your caucus, your elected caucus, is in cabinet, and the other close to 60% want to be in cabinet. And so it's really important that cabinet understand that their job is not only to represent the government in the public interest, but also to represent the elected caucus representatives that are representing their constituents. It's really important. I tried to develop roles for people in the caucus if they weren't in cabinet. I remember, I'll give you one example. We had a member of the legislature that was from a military constituency, the Air Force constituency, and her father was in the military. She was very connected to the military. So I created Manitoba's first military liaison officer, and that, she was a caucus member, and she became that. And I think subsequently that position existed with the former government, and it exists, I'm sure, with the new Premier Bob Canoe. So sometimes you can find different roles for caucus members to keep them involved. Having said that, there was disagreements in caucus, and I remember one time there was a real disagreement on gun registration. We had an urban caucus, a northern caucus, a rural caucus of elected representatives. And I remember there was a recommendation from one of our cabinet ministers that we have a vote. And I said, well, we don't need a vote. Everybody in the city is going to vote one way, and everybody in Thompson, Manitoba, the PA, I can tell you what the vote is. So let's try to find a consensus. I said, the people that are outside of the city of Winnipeg will probably lose their seats with all the hunters we have already voting for us, but we're not going to have many more if we don't understand the symbolism of this move. And so it was a really feisty debate, but we did come around to understanding each other, so we could basically make a decision not to support the federal gun registration as it affected hunting rifles. Of course, we always supported Kim Campbell's resolution on assault rifles, and a long time before that. So that's one issue. And I remember another very important issue in caucus is banning union and corporate donations. And some of the people were very opposed to that. It was a very feisty debate, and we ended up doing it, but not everybody was happy. And then a third issue in caucus is when you're bringing in a budget, you can't discuss some of your measures in caucus, because you only announce them in terms of the market. So when we were reducing corporate tax in Manitoba, which was quite high, higher than Alberta at that time, 17%, gradually down to 12%, and then lower than that, and then limiting small business tax, caucus was some members of caucus were very upset that we didn't consult with them ahead of time. And you try to explain based on market realities, you can't. So it's a dynamic group of people that are all have the courage to put their name on a ballot and get elected, and they're very committed to the cause, but there is healthy democratic tension within caucus. I would say to people listening to this podcast, The caucus members are all very important. If you have an issue with your, that you want the government to know about, you have an MLA in your area, elected representative of the area, they will be heard by the cabinet minister, and they will be heard by the premier, or in the case of the prime minister, by the prime minister. And you're never wasting your time with any member of a caucus, because they're elected and they're heard by the government of the day. So it's spicy, but it's part of democracy.
That's a great point to remind people of, that as a backbencher in a government caucus, you have the ability to bring the concerns of your constituents right to the minister, or right to the premier or prime minister. I remember that there's a by-election happening right now in my old riding, because I left last summer. Let's go from east to west. Ed, Gary spoke about some of the dynamics that he tried to address so that there wasn't two tiers between cabinet members of caucus and the non-cabinet, the backbench members. Certainly, I used to joke that my Alberta caucus, when I was leader, and I'm sure Jason Kenney would say the same, there was almost two caucuses. There was the rural caucus versus the Calgary Edmonton caucus. How did you try and address the disparate views of caucus? As Gary said, there's sometimes a wide scale of opinion on things. What was your leadership style to try and forge that broad consensus into key priorities for your government?
One of the lessons that I learned in Ralph Klein's cabinet, and also sitting around the caucus table, was that if there was a time where a decision was made by cabinet, or let's say by a few close people, premier, without full caucus participation, generally that was a wrong decision, or a decision that wasn't accepted by caucus, nor sometimes even the people of Alberta. So caucus participation is critical. That was in two different situations, obviously. One, assuming the leadership after Ralph had retired, and with, as Gary had, members that were there already. There were certain allegiances to other candidates, obviously, in the leadership. And we had to make sure that we would bring them all together. And my comment at that time was, most successful organizations generally fall apart from within, not from outside. So if we work together, be frank with each other, and bring our differences, our opinions to caucus, and keep them around that caucus table, which was increasingly important. The other was appointing a whip that was respected, that was open, that had the time to spend with individual caucus members. Because those of us who to lead a caucus will also know that there are many differences other than just the policy of, the policies that you're bringing forward. There's some personnel issues. There's a variety of issues that WHIP has to work around and try and keep everyone happy. The other is the smaller your caucus, I should say smaller majority, easy to work with everybody and find them a meaningful responsibility. Our biggest challenge in 2008, when we won a huge majority, 72 out of 83 seats, you try and keep everyone busy and give them responsibilities. And that was a challenge. The other, and Gary mentioned this about budget discussions, tried to open it up as much as we could, get input from everybody. There were some very important decisions that can only be done around the Treasury Board table, and we try and involve as many caucus members as possible to get the information out. But some of it had to be kept confidential until the speech. The other was having and we're quite fortunate because we had a good working group where caucus member spouses were involved. We did a lot of things together with various charitable organizations, made sure that there was events to bring caucus member spouses to Edmonton, to Calgary, because they're all part of the family. And if somebody, as an elected member felt comfortable at home, that certainly made for an easier work for the member, the caucus member, because many of them, as you know, travel great miles away from home, and just the health and welfare of every member was important. The decisions, there were many over a period of time that were critical, and we'll talk about it maybe later in terms of the most divisive decisions. But I found that biggest one that we had, I think, in that first round before my election was that around royalties, oil and gas royalties, and that just opened up a huge debate. Kind of created more tension between Edmonton and Calgary, gas industry and environmental groups, and we had many robust discussions around the caucus table. But I felt that everybody had their opportunity. At the end of the day, vote, and you live with the votes, and that proved to be the most successful, most important part, is to keep those differences discussed around the caucus table. Once a decision is made, go with the majority.
Excellent. I think the theme, Christy, that we're hearing from your colleagues is that everyone wants to have the full discussion, challenge, and everything within the room, and that there be no divisions between the hierarchy of cabinet, the caucus. Every member of caucus deserves input in whatever they could do. Ed brought in the importance of his choice for whip in terms of maintaining that morale and caucus engagement. In your experience as premier, were those similar circumstances? What did you bring? Did you have even more hands-on post leadership with a new caucus? Were there things that you did to try and bring that unity in the room?
Thanks, Peter. By the way, it's nice to see you again. I haven't seen you in a long. I think a lot of people in Canada are probably thinking, "Wow, Peter O'Toole was just, he wasn't so divisive. Well, we kind of miss him." So it's very nice to see you. And Gary, of course, as ambassador to the United States, did an amazing job, and especially in fighting for Western interests. So nice to see you. And Ed, I don't think I've seen you since we served together. Maybe last time was in 2010 or no, maybe 2012 or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's really nice to be here, and to the Canada West Foundation and Gary Marr as well. So I both Gary and Ed have kind of outlined most of the salient points. I'll just give a little context, Peter, for me, because I got elected in 2011 out of a very divisive leadership that we had after Gordon Campbell resigned. Our party was in a bit of, when a leader resigns, never fun. Party's never in good shape if the leader has to resign. You've got some recovery to do, no matter who the leader is, and that's certainly no comment on Gordon. But I got elected. I had one member of caucus supporting me. And he wasn't the most popular one. And so I walk in there, and the caucus, none of them wanted me to be there. None of them did. But there was a range, a lot of people that sort of went with the other guy because they thought they were supposed to, and they weren't very passionate about it. Some people were very passionate. So the caucus sort of broke down into two halves. The half that Gordon Campbell had put into cabinet, who wanted to stay in cabinet, and they wanted to stay in cabinet. So lots of them came on side pretty quickly. Then there was the rest of the caucus who didn't have anything to lose. Some of them wanted in, but they didn't think their odds were really great. And that was a problem. So for my first 2 years, and by the way, by the time we got to the election in 2013, we were like 22 points behind in the polls. So not like I was, really selling everybody on the idea that any of them might ever see the inside of a cabinet room again. But what we did is I ended up reappointing most of the members of cabinet that Gordon had chosen, because most of them were the right people. And it was a caucus that had been around, it was a little long in the tooth. Not everybody probably should have still, offered to serve again. And so I put the most competent people back in cabinet, but I did bring this to the job, which I really had this experience when I was in caucus myself before, when I was cabinet minister and then when I was in opposition. It was that everybody who runs for office should have the dignity of being able to do something when they get there. And, it is hard to keep people busy, that's for sure. And the bigger your caucus is, as Ed said, the harder it gets. But in this group, we worked really hard to give everybody a meaningful job. So, and I would let people choose their job, so someone was interested in prison reform. He wrote a really great report on how to reform some aspects of our prison system in BC. And we acted on that, even though he wasn't a cabinet minister. So there was lots of that sort of work of keeping people busy, giving them some dignity in the jobs that they had. And the other rule that we had in caucus was everybody listens. So as Gary said, don't bring your big books in. We're all listening here. And caucus members had free acts. Like, caucus members would often criticize cabinet ministers quite openly, politely, but openly. And we would sometimes change decisions based on what caucus members said. The third lesson that I had was from Peter Lougheed, who I never had the privilege of meeting. But Ed, you might have told me this, or it might have been Ralph Klein, that the most important thing to remember when you're the premier is that your caucus is your first and most important audience. They represent the whole province. They represent a diversity of the province as well. And you are richer for that diversity, so use it. When caucus would start talking about, how this isn't going over well in my community, and you'd start to see that it wasn't an uncommon complaint, I always made sure we listened. And I would go to the cabinet minister and I would say, and the deputy minister, we need to change or modify our direction on this, because we aren't going to be able to sell it. The most important job of every caucus member, the single most important thing they can do, and we all know this, is get re-elected. Because if you don't get re-elected, you don't get to stay in government. So finding ways to make sure we were listening to them in caucus, seeing the trends in that open discussion we would have, was really super important for us. The last thing, Erin, to add to this is, when I got elected, we had a 1-seat majority in a bipartisan parliament, right? There were no third parties. So every single day for 2 years, well, not every single day, the last year, I would go into caucus and I would say, okay, guys, we have, and I always knew, 12 question periods or 22 question periods or whatever it was until we get to spring break or whatever. I just need everybody to walk in there today and remember, we're trying not to elect an NDP government here. So just hold your fire, hold, your friendly fire inside our own government for the next half hour. That's all I need you to do, is just today. And we made it out of there. But I'll tell you, having a 1-vote majority in a 2-party legislature was probably one of the most difficult things I've ever done.
Yeah, to be on every single day. Let me take this back through everyone, but starting with you, Christy. It's interesting. Each of you talked about coming in and having a caucus that had people that had been in cabinet, in some cases, people you'd run for leader against. You had pretty overwhelming odds, Christy, in terms of, resounding caucus support from one other of your colleagues. Are there some steps that each of you took to bring in people from the other side of a leadership to kind of say, as you said, we need to unite as a team to take the fight to our opponents? I'll start back with you, Christy. Is there you kept the cabinet largely similar to what Gordon Campbell had, but were there a couple of people that you really sort of tried to sort of enlist in your effort to build unity? And then I'd love thoughts from Ed and Gary on that same point.
That's an insightful question. Because that's the part that really nobody sees. Even I don't think cabinet members see it when you're doing it. I took sort of a couple of approaches. One was with people who really, really, really did not like me, but they were in the cabinet. Some of whom were my opponents. The way I approached that was to give them a lot of really high profile jobs so that everybody would think that they were important. Knowing that in the Premier's office, you have all the power. You really do, right? You control all the deputy ministers, you control the bureaucracy, but ministers, some of them really need to feel like they've got lots and lots of responsibility. And the second one was, I got in the habit of giving cabinet members who I felt had been underestimated by my predecessor really big jobs. So one of them, I went to her and I said, what do you want to do? And she said, I met with everybody beforehand and I said, what do you want to do, now that we're in government? And she said, I want to be the Solicitor General. And so I met with her 3 days later and I said, you're the Solicitor General. And she started to cry. And I said, why are you crying? She said, well, I never thought you would do it. Because women never get the guns and the money in government, right? So she was so happy about having been recognized for her talent. And this was true of quite a number. I won their loyalty pretty quickly.
Give people big jobs and depend on them. Ed, Gary, any thoughts on how you brought that unity after challenging leadership races?
Well, I think it's a good point about listening to the caucus and then the Premier going back to the cabinet minister if they didn't get it and say, this dog won't hunt. If it won't hunt in caucus, it's not going to hunt with the public. There's always few people in caucus that want your job. It's a competitive political environment. I think that's healthy in a caucus and in a cabinet, to have people that are trying to perform and also keeping one eye on the future. I think you want people that are ambitious because they bring a lot of energy, ideas, and effort to the job. The other thing about caucus, though, is one of the things they recognize in terms of the person who's leader, the party leader, whether I guess it's the prime minister or the premier, is that in today's society, in today's election, the premier's on every ballot. So as MLAs, they want you to do well, because if you do well, the way the media covers it, they're pretty focused in on the leader's tour, the leader's promises, the leader's, popularity or lack of popularity, the leader's results in terms of keeping their promises, et cetera, et cetera. So there is that dynamic in caucus as well. But in terms of cabinet, I always wanted, it's like anything in business now. You always want 4 or 5 people in any succession planning that could take over the CEO's role. And you don't want to be left without somebody if, God forbid, a bus runs over the leader. And you want that in government too. You want that. It's a healthy thing to have ambition, but as long as it's, accountable ambition and accountable to the people and the caucus. And Christy's point about, if a lot of people in caucus are worried about a decision of a cabinet minister, and if they don't get it, you got to go back and make sure they get it, because that's what the public are thinking.
Thanks, Ed. Any thoughts on building the team of rivals and bringing people in after a race?
The first cabinet put together after the leadership had, of course, a number of people that are strong supporters, and also some of the candidates that were into leadership, and they were assigned substantial roles of cabinet. It worked fine because everybody was focused on, of course, the next election, doing well. And it was a time where, we had some members in Caucus that were leaning hard right, and most in the center. So there were policies that came forward that we had considerable amount of debate and try and find some common ground before the policies came into the legislature for debate and passing as legislation. It's difficult, obviously, when the minister may have had a misstep, and you call them in and have a discussion, but also not to be critical to a point where you do it in a public setting, you know, in front of the caucus or anything, but have a private conversation and just get a better feel as why they're taking that particular position, and ask them to modify the position. The other thing is, and I'm sure we'll all agree, when you're selecting cabinet, it's not generally the skill sets that get you there. It's geography, diversity, gender. We found that if you have an X number of cabinet ministers from Edmonton, you got a same from Calgary. And Southern Alberta has to be represented in Northern Alberta. And you try and look at the number of people that you have to choose from and make those decisions. Very interesting. In my time, media always focused on the size of it. Oh my God, you've got 18 cabinet ministers. Like, how can we do this? Subsequent governments had half of their caucus in cabinet. And, it was okay. So changing times, and it's interesting to see how the premiers today carry on in terms of electing cabinet, size of cabinet, etc. But it's something that I noticed lately from our time, Gary and Christy.
Let's build on that, because that was one of the areas we're going to try and explore, how you build in perspectives to your cabinet while also having the balance, the diversity you needed. My father, when I was in the Air Force, my father ran and was part of the Mike Harris government in Ontario, and my dad never made cabinet, and he used to say to me, it's the 3 G's: geography, gender, and generosity. Because in the Ontario PC days, each of the ministers had to raise a certain amount of money for the party. So if you were a good fundraiser, that was almost as important as geography. But you also want experience, judgment, thoughtfulness. Ed kicked this off. I think this is a great subject. Obviously, Gary, in your province, it's Winnipeg and everything else. How did you balance off whether you call it the 3 G's or perspectives from your political spectrum, left, right, center for the NDP as a brokerage party? How did you bring that into your decisions on cabinet to get the balance right?
Well, there's no question you have different views and different values in any caucus or any cabinet, and it does swing. It can swing ideologically, but mostly once you get in government, it's mostly getting it done. I don't want to sound like another premier in Ontario, but I used to use that term all the time. People just want to get it done, and they don't want us to have a debating club to get there again. I think you have to, in terms of cabinet, choosing the caucus members who go in cabinet, you've got to pick 3 or 4 of your most skilled, not only political representatives that are elected, but also very, very skilled people in managing large portfolios and also communicating. Because part of the job is managing, and obviously because of the public interest, you want, for example, a very, very, very good communicator in finance. You want a very, and for the NDP, it's always perceived as a vulnerability. So you want somebody that is very good. You need, today's, in any government now, healthcare, you really want one of your best managers and communicators in a portfolio like health. And so there's other positions in government, the industry. You want people that are natural with the business community. If you're a government like ours, you want somebody in labor. They had a hard time explaining why we're going to ban union donations when I made the decision. And trying to explain to people, we'd rather have your support based on passing a law to have better workplace safety and health without a check exchange. We wanted to do it for the public interest, but you want to have those kind of communicators in an NDP government. But you choose four or five of your best leaders to take the most difficult portfolios, and people that have an impatience to them so they don't dither, because you don't want dithering cabinet ministers. And the caucus does not want dithering cabinet ministers either, because the media smells a ditherer a mile away. But you want also their communication skills, and not blame the press if they get bad press, blame themselves, starting with that. So but that's where you start, with the 3 or 4 key public portfolios and the talent to go in there.
Christy, what about you? How did you try and get the right balance within your cabinet, both for your party, which of course party now has a new name, and it's always kind of struggled with its the Conservatives and Liberals in the mix. How did you have, the Lower Mainland, Interior, the island? Did these calculations go into your finding the right balance for cabinet?
Yes, absolutely. So I started in 2011, and I always kept the cabinet, I think, under 20 or under. And because I remember Gordon Campbell saying to me, Christy, you can never go smaller. You can always go bigger. And at the end of his term, he had a giant cabinet. I think it was a majority of caucus that was in cabinet at the end. And I don't think he liked that, but you just can't shrink it and without having a lot of unrest. So in terms of my priorities for cabinet, I also wanted to we were the first gender equal cabinet in Canada. And we really worked hard to do that. It's tough though. I mean, when you start getting into playing that numbers game, you almost always end up with people that shouldn't be in cabinet. Like if you're going to say, we're going to make it, if you're mostly women and you say we're going to have half of them be men, some of the men probably shouldn't be there. If you're being forced to do that. And same with any of those kinds of numbers games that you're trying to find to do. So that was a little bit tricky, but it doesn't mean that the cabinet ministers aren't good. They're not going to be finance minister, was sort of the reality that you're facing. We paid a lot of attention to making sure that there were people from different cultural communities, in particular South Asian and Asian communities in our cabinet. And that was important, not for the public perception. Both of these things I felt were really important for the input that we got. So I'll give you an example. We were arguing something about pollution controls on cars at cabinet. And the finance minister came in with it, and he wanted to get rid of having it, blah, blah, blah. And everybody spoke on it. And I realized at the end of it, none of the women had spoken. So I thought, well, I'm going to go out. So I said, Shirley, what do you think? And I went around the table with women. All the women opposed the decision that the finance minister was proposing, and none of them had said anything. And so I said to everybody, you know what, folks? Half the voters are women. And we have heard what women think, so we're not doing it. And it's just a real life example of how important, why you have those voices around the table. It's not just so they can sit behind you in question period and make you look good. It's because they really do bring a very different perspective to it. And I guess for me, Gary's point about who are the most important people in cabinet, most important jobs, really reflects your party's needs in lots of ways. So if you're a New Democrat, you want to get a certain kind of finance minister. If you're a BC Liberal, probably lots of people in your caucus, people don't see that necessarily as a weakness. But you do want to make sure that you have a fantastic education minister and a fantastic health minister. And in my case, I had, I think, the best health minister we've ever had in BC. He was a little bit left. He was probably more left-wing than anybody else in the caucus. Redhead, always said what he wanted to say. Nobody pushed him around. And I can tell you, having Terry at our cabinet table was probably one of the most important inputs that we had, because he would challenge everybody at the table all the time. And that always, I think in many ways that helped make sure that we won the election in 2013.
You kick this off, Ed. I'd like to come back to you for a few final thoughts on this diversity of opinion and makeup of a cabinet. As Christy said, sometimes she asked for input from voices that were silent. Did you see your role as premier as chairing that cabinet to say, make sure that one or two voices don't dominate the discussion, that you get all perspectives in the debate?
As when I talked earlier about some of the more difficult decisions that you had to make, and as Gary said, following up on promises made in the campaign, and one was with respect to royalties. I can't remember all of the meetings that we had with the cabinet, all of cabinet, to discuss the issue, and made sure that everyone had good input, but also because the topic itself was quite complicated, complex in terms of the wells and oil sands, and there was so much coming into the discussion that it took months of additional information. Questions were asked, they'd go back to the bureaucracy, come back, and you needed the patience to get it right. But as long as everyone felt comfortable and expressing their concerns really about it. The other, though, there were some of the discussions, especially with respect to the plan to end homelessness, where I thought through discussion with the private sector, public sector, all kind of organizations, came up with a plan. And the first one that was actually Housing First that was adopted, that there were some people around the caucus table and the cabinet table that said, oh, geez, if we're going to go with this Housing First plan and people will have a home, how will we ever get them out of it? Like just diverse opinions. And it was so surprising. Then here's a real issue and bigger now than ever right across Canada. And we're having these discussions about what I thought were not realistic at all in terms of how do we deal with the addictions and mental illness. And we come up with this, position. So it really had to breathe deep and be patient and work through those issues. And we did in the end. But that's just an example of how sometimes around the caucus, but especially cabinet table, you come up with these extremely diverse opinions, positions, trying to build consensus.
Oh, that's great. And I remember when I was researching the housing, the homelessness and addiction issue for our own policy, listening to a BBC podcast where they focused on medicine and some of the groundbreaking work being done by Alberta on that issue. Ed alluded to some of the most challenging, the divisive decisions that you might have presided over when you were premiers. He talked about the royalty issue. I'm going to start with you, Gary. Can you maybe talk about one of the most divisive issues that your caucus faced and what the role of cabinet and of the backbench was in helping your caucus as a government caucus? You can't just criticize, you have to actually lead the province through the decision. I don't want to dredge up old bad memories, but can you think of something that we could learn from in terms of how the entire caucus got the team through that divisive period?
Well, I mentioned earlier the gun registration debate, and that was a doozy for the government and for myself. We had 2 Cree cabinet ministers, very competent. One of them had built a shopping mall in his reserve before he ran for office, and he built a whole new school system that had great success rates for graduation. But a lot of the people he represented, would work hard in the wood mills and then hunt and fish on the weekends. And then, of course, we had another Cree minister on the other side, same view. And then we had people in agricultural areas. And then, of course, we had the urban view, of course, that, it's an oversimplification because lots of people in Winnipeg like to hunt and fish, but the MLAs kind of had a totally different view in Winnipeg. And that's when they challenged me to have a vote. And that's when I canceled it. I said, I know the vote. Everybody in Winnipeg is going to go one way, and everybody outside of Winnipeg is going to go another. So we don't need a vote. We got to we've got to respect the fact that people outside of Winnipeg feel they're going to lose their seats on this issue because it's an emotional issue. It still is in Canadian discussions. So I was really happy with the original Kim Campbell bill that was passed after the horrible massacre in Montreal, and I thought that we had a pretty good balance between the rights of hunters and in our province. But that was the toughest issue in our caucus that I recall. The other tough issue is, why didn't you talk to me about a budget decision that we couldn't talk about because the legal advice we had is you had to keep things inside the room until you announced it because of the market. So that's really tough because people say, what am I, chopped liver? And you can't say you don't trust them. You just have to say we're following legal advice on when we make these financial announcements, and we're going to follow that because the last thing we want to do is be offside on the law and securities commissions and everything else as a government. But there's some tough issues, as I say, and I would say the gun registration was the one I dealt with the most. Every time Alan Rock took his trench coat out and made another announcement, we had to manage it somehow. I wish he would have got rid of that damn trench coat. However, I digress.
Well, I'm happy to say, Gary, that issue was still a live one in my election in 2021. And the fact that the media and certain politicians could play the distinction between an assault weapon or an assault style weapon. Guns and butter in Canada. Guns are challenging butter with supply management. It's all guns and butter, right? Christy, how about you? I know that the environment and some of the trailblazing work you were a part of and Gordon brought with the price on carbon. Was there a divisive issue like that your caucus and cabinet and your leadership had to help the whole team get through?
Carbon taxes was something by the time I got there, people were pretty comfortable with it because it was revenue neutral. We were delivering huge tax cuts to people because, as you remember, Erin, we had every penny that came in, we'd do an account at the end of the year for how much carbon tax we'd collected, and then we would deliver tax cuts. And a lot of personal tax cuts to people. So we were, people had kind of gotten comfortable with it. People still hate the carbon tax in British Columbia. It's like you can't sell it, but it didn't turn out to be a stumbling block. People kind of, I think, I don't know, absorbed that it was happening. I would say there were two things that really we stumbled over with caucus. One of them, and I think the very most important one, was the Indigenous relations work that we were doing. 203 First Nations in British Columbia, a third of all the First Nations in Canada. Almost all of them are untreated. We had to really chart a new course. We had to find our own path because none of this had already been done. None of this had been settled. None of these rights had been decided. The Supreme Court was making decisions at the same time, and we had to kind of keep up with them. And we were building LNG. And in order to build LNG, we needed to find consent with First Nations along the way, which was really complicated. So we were making agreements with First Nations, and some of those were really broad agreements that covered the whole province. And it was in rural communities, as my colleagues and you will certainly know, Erin, these things really hit home. You know, the use of the land is everything in rural communities, and the threat that people felt to their own livelihood very directly from, you know, the potential for some of these agreements was unfounded most of the time, but it was real fear. So that was very difficult to find our way through, because our caucus was more rural than it was urban overall. And you know, those voters and those MLAs really mattered to us. So that was a very kind of tiptoeing around a lot of issues in that, and really working hard all the time to manage people's legitimate fear and legitimate anger that they felt. And kind of, we were in communities doing town halls, and we were working with MLAs constantly. Like, it was tough. But we got through it, actually, and now we've got LNG. So the other one was teacher strikes. So when I was education minister, we had the longest strike in BC history, because we'd repatriated a lot of management rights out of the contracts that the NDP had stuck in there that were very, very costly. And then when I became the premier, we had the longest strike in BC history, although a lot of it was over the summer. And that was, you know, I bet you, at least, I don't know about you, Gary, but I do know that probably Ed oversaw a teacher strike. And the thing is, I said to the guys in Ontario, look, here's what's going to happen. Your caucus is going to be going, yeah. Let's just, you know, put those teachers out on strike. And then 2 weeks later, they're going to come back and they go, we have to resolve this. We have to resolve this, because their phones are ringing off the hook. Parents don't know what to do with their kids. People are worried about exams and university applications, and everybody just wants it all to end. That is, I would argue that is an even tougher fight to have, because it's such a conflagration, and it's so much money at stake over a period of time. So I don't know, I'm kind of interested in what my colleagues are going to say about their teacher strikes, because I bet you guys had some too.
It's one thing that unites rural and urban. Everyone has kids that need to go to school.
That's right.
Ed, you know, you alluded a few times to the royalty issue your government faced. Any learnings that you have from challenging issue? It's clear the rural-urban divide fuels a lot of the challenges in terms of public policy. Any ways that you had caucus and cabinet helping you guys manage that time?
It was at a time where unprecedented oil prices, all the eyes of the world were on Alberta. We had so many state-owned enterprises wanting to buy into Alberta oil production. Along with high oil prices, you've got issues, drug issues, gangs. We had so many people moving in from other provinces. Just to quote one study, out of 100,000 people that moved to Alberta, about 12,000 are children. So they're not all paying taxes. You need teachers, you need a hospital bed, a nurse, all those other costs coming, weighing on government. So it was necessary to review, and oddly enough, Premier Lougheed was the first one to review, and he had his fair share of issues in that first term of going through a review. And since the review we did, it's been reviewed twice, stayed the same, so that pretty well has settled down. But so difficult to communicate to Albertans many of the other issues that government then had to face because of good times, a lot of revenue, but the expenses were growing at an alarming rate. But when I talk about royalties, we expected that there'll be some pushback. But the one area that surprised me was the construction of critical infrastructure, and that was our obviously a need. No matter who did the review, we're critically short, continued right across Canada, actually, of transmission. And it became a property rights issue, not the fact that we had to move electrons from south, north, east to west. It's you're building it on my land, and I don't have a say in it. Although all of the surface rights legislations in place, land compensation, increased compensation for power line on your property. And today, it's built, thank the good Lord, because minus 40, we managed to overcome the challenge. But that was the biggest surprise. I mean, how we lost that debate in terms of the necessity of it to a property right thing. And it was difficult to recover.
In our remaining time here, this has been a great discussion. It's been interesting to see how, despite the differences between each province, some of the same rural urban, some of the same longer term challenges in terms of communicating benefit to the public are consistent across the country. Gary talked about having kind of the best managers and communicators on your key files, and Christy talked about the stress of teacher strikes and obviously healthcare negotiations. Sometimes even when you get a great communicator, the education minister in Ontario, Stephen Lecce, is a good friend. He worked for us in the Harper government. He's such a good communicator, he can't leave that file. They will never shuffle him out of education, which is, I think, cruel and unusual after a few 3 or 4 years in the portfolio. I'd love just a quick around the horn in terms of, would you rather have a better manager on a key file or a better communicator? Because I think increasingly in the social media age, it's almost more important to get your message out than to really have a handle on the file in the department. But I'd love, maybe starting with you, Christy, your top portfolios, and do you want a manager or a communicator? Your thoughts on that?
I don't think you can choose between the two for like finance, education, and healthcare. I mean, you really have to, they have to be good communicators for sure. You can make up for some of the management shortfalls of ministers in general with great deputies. And so I would always try and make sure that the combination was right. Some ministers who might be a little less experienced and, as managers, or less experienced in government, if you gave them a great deputy, that could really make a difference, I found. But you really, in finance, in health, and in education, because the ministers are doing so much of the front end work in design, understanding the politics of it, understanding how things, a finance minister needs to really understand how all of the changes, some of them which may apparently seem quite small to bureaucrats, are going to find their way into people's pocketbook at the end of the day. So there is a real management role for a finance minister. Same with healthcare, same with education. And I guess the only other thing I would say about that would be, for some ministries, they're big, they're fat, they're immovable. Health ministries are like that, in particular in most provinces. You really do need someone at the political level who's going to really have the ability to push things through, to make sure that things actually get done, and to build in accountability. Because the bigger a ministry is, the harder it is to kind of push the pig through the python and get it to come out the other end. Boy, that's not a great analogy. The picture I've just drawn is not.
It's harder
I
to
mean, the
turn
farmers
the
in the group will understand why.
Gary, any thoughts on that for the top
Well,
portfolios, the issue manager versus communicator?
Well, I actually believe, and even in the private sector now, a good manager, a good CEO has got to be a good communicator. In today's, with 24-hour news cycles and different specific media coverage, say in business and et cetera now, and obviously in politics, you've got to, I would look in a CEO to be a good communicator too, because they're dealing with markets, they're dealing with customers, they're dealing with innovation, they're dealing with AI, they're dealing with all kinds of things. So they really have to have those skills. I agree with Christy. You can always get an excellent deputy to manage a lot of the issues in a department. You really want to match the minister and the deputy together in terms of what you need. That's really, really important. And in healthcare, you want to have a lot of communication done by people with stethoscopes around their necks, because for somebody in a white lab coat and a stethoscope is more credible than perhaps a politician. So you want to think beyond just the minister and the deputy minister. You want to think about the healthcare consumer and get people that have credibility in that regard. It's a whole different world. You got, the old days of communication are changed for business and in politics.
Yeah, it's true.
Well said. Ed, any thoughts on this communicating and managing in your cabinet?
In the ministries that we talked about earlier before, communication is key. I'd like to add another ministry to it, and that's social services and children's services. I think we've all had challenges in those ministries, and to have someone that appears so passionate in terms of talking about a particular issue in the ministry seems to, the better the communication settles the situation down. Management, I agree with everyone. Deputies are important, and a good deputy will not be afraid to speak up to the minister, and those skills are hard to find today. No doubt about it. But I remember over the years the deputies that we've had in critical roles, and especially in the early 90s when we were outsourcing so many things out of government, it needed a different thought process, more private sector focused, get the job done. And so we were successful in that area. But communication is key. And there's some people that today that are heading larger companies or even in government that are so natural in their communication skill, and they do attract a following. There's no doubt about it. And I've got a lot to learn in that area.
Me too. This has been a fascinating discussion, and obviously there's so much on the shoulders of a premier, the ability to be the chief executive for the province and for the government and for the caucus. But what did you rely on in your experience in making sure you could gauge the trust of your caucus and that you could hear from them adequately? Did you engage, your whip? Ed, you talked about the importance of that whip for your caucus. Some leaders also have an open door policy themselves. Some use their chief of staff as well as a bit of a person to sort of put their finger on the pulse. One thing I found surprising when we lost government in 2015 and the Trudeau government came in, speaking with Liberal MPs, the Trudeau government, at least early on, used to make MPs apply the day before caucus to raise an issue at caucus. Had they tried to instill that on our caucus, there would have been a mutiny that you had to apply to be on the list. Talk about how your caucus were able to get, an issue in front of you as premier, and how you relied on, say, your caucus officers, your whip, and your chief of staff. Maybe starting with you, Gary, we'll go around the horn on how you managed to make sure that you were staying in touch with your caucus.
Well, there would have been a revolt in our caucus too if they had to have prior consent, and there's a little bit of anti-authoritarian, in all of our cultures and all of our personalities. I found, fun. I think if you spend a little time during debates, going around just chatting with people, and in the House, in the chamber, you can find out certain things that they may not say in caucus or may not say to your staff. I also found the best way to really know how a caucus member was feeling and doing was actually in the travel I did as premier to their constituencies and spending time. I think the best way to find out what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what their support is in the communities that elected them is make sure that you incorporate them in your premier's tour, your leader's tour, right at the beginning, right at the front end, and involve them in the visits you make to their constituency. And then you pick up through the public how well your representative is in that constituency. So I found the best way to deal with caucus was get out of the building, get out and spend time where the folks are. And then you found out a lot about your own caucus members as well.
Mm-hmm.
Christy, same for you, or did you have your whip give you updates on, who needed a call, this sort of thing, or how did you manage it?
The whip was helpful on that stuff. I would say more though, we had my staff in the premier's office was very focused on, I mean, for obvious reasons. For the first, we all started by this trial of fire with a one member. We had members in caucus who would be texting reporters from, right before question period, telling them, how mad, to try and set the news agenda for the day. So, it was not a great caucus time for that period, and our staff in the premier's office learned to be very, very attuned. So we were all in constant communication with caucus. And as Gary said, I was, it's a great plan to be out there traveling around, getting on the horse, riding into the stampede, all that stuff, and making sure that you are, because as you know, Ed, the biggest non-invitational stampede in Canada is in Williams Lake, British Columbia, not in Calgary. And so we would just sort of stay on top of it that way. But I did, Gary said, go to the chamber. I found the best time, because you have to sit in the chamber, or the premier probably doesn't, but the caucus does for a certain amount of time. And they've got their house duty, and it is boring. And it's so easy to just go in there and sidle up to somebody for 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, and just talk about whatever. That was, for me, the most effective use of my time with caucus that there is, because it's FaceTime, you're one-on-one, everybody just wants to talk, and they're sitting in the chamber beside the premier and everybody can see it happening. And I think it feels pretty good for people. But that personal contact, because one person can bring a caucus down, one person can, and people do need to feel heard. And they need to feel valued. And otherwise, I think we don't respect the dignity of their office as MLAs, even though they're not in cabinet, and they deserve that respect.
So let me put one quick thing before I go to Christy. Since you knew that time in the chamber was really great, that you could sit down next to somebody, say that was a good point, you made a good. Did you schedule time for you to be in the chamber more than you would have, because that was such a positive experience?
Yes, I never had scheduled house time ever, because I was always running around and it was impossible. The numbers couldn't hinge on me being there, I guess, was the view of the staff. But if I was hanging around if I was working in the legislature in my office, just down the hall, easy to pop in for 15 minutes or so. So, it was kind of nice to not have to be there, have everybody know I didn't have to be there, but I was just there to be able to communicate with them. And I loved it too, because I loved getting to know what was going on with them and their families. Like, in lots of ways, I don't know how you guys felt, but I felt like my caucus was my family.
Well said. Ed, similar approach to you, a lot of good time in the chamber. Did you rely on whip in your office? Talk about how you maintain that trust and gauge the sort of will of caucus.
Number of things. One, definitely, especially in evening sittings, you can grab, your briefcase, go into the ledge, into the chambers, and do some signing, talk to individual members, spend some time, and kind of share in that boring part of serving as an MLA, sitting through the House and keeping the numbers for government. The other, Gary talked about travel, extensive travel to various constituencies, especially during the summer. Everybody had agriculture events, oil shows, individual constituencies. We used to take our caucus and have caucus meetings in parts of Alberta. that helped as well. Introduce the MLAs to a different part of Alberta and to get them more familiar. But also a lot of individual time with caucus. Was fortunate my wife Marie spent a lot of time with the houses. I got to know, some of the family challenges, maybe illness in a family or other different pressures. And those were very important. And that's, at the end of the day, politics is all about building relationships. And those relationships are so important. You never know when they're become even more important, but the more enduring relationships you can build over time, certainly help. And, and it's not just the caucus members, but also their caucus staff. Walk into the office sometimes unannounced and say hi, because as you know, for every caucus member, that staff member is the first person that the public converses with. If it's an issue in caucus or an issue in the constituency, they're the ones that take the call. So to make them feel important is great positive consequence to the successful operation of government like that.
Great discussion. And I felt the same way. Caucus can be like family. And when family gets isolated or alone, it was hard, particularly for me during COVID, when teams weren't even meeting in person. We were meeting on Zoom, and the poor MPs in British Columbia would be there at 6 a.m. and in their pajamas in some cases. It changed kind of the dynamic completely in terms of maintaining sort of a morale in caucus. And I certainly know the feeling of live texting, Christy, from caucus ahead of question period or ahead of caucus meetings. In the last 15 minutes or so that we have here, we're talking about building trust. We're also talking about policy creation. Going back to the backbench again, and so your caucus writ large, as you're developing policy, each of you talked about the challenges in crafting a budget, because a backbench member of caucus may not get that direct input because of the process. But how well was caucus able to develop policy for the government, both delivering on promises that you ran on the election, or perhaps developing policy in advance of the next election? Were, in your experiences, your caucus able to generate ideas? Before the 2015 election, Prime Minister Harper asked me to canvass caucus. I was not yet in cabinet. We held 80 different meetings with provincial caucuses and developed policies, much of which was completely ignored, sadly. But was there an outlet for your caucus to be able to develop policy as needs arose? Maybe start with Christy and go back through each of you on how you allowed and fostered that ability for caucus to develop policy for the government, and not just through private members' bills.
Mm-hmm. I think it is different. It's going to be a little different at provincial than federal level, just because caucuses are smaller and the task of keeping people busy is easier when the group is smaller. People are less likely to get lost, and they have a lot more access to cabinet ministers directly. So we did have processes at first. I think, we're really focused on it. People doing committee, doing internal caucus groups, but they were all on committees as well, on legislative committees. Nobody was not doing a committee. So they all were busy with that. And then members would go to cabinet ministers all the time with their ideas, and ministers were obligated to answer them. And because the caucus member would get up in caucus and say, I've talked to the finance minister about X, and I want to make sure that we do it. And the finance minister doesn't want it to come up in caucus. So was it really, I would say, Erin, my experience with it was people were too busy for us to do, although we tried it, kind of internal caucus committees. We kind of had a little bit a looser approach to it, where members would just actively go and talk to ministers themselves, or to me directly, or they would do it through their legislative committees that they were a part of.
Gary, what about you in terms of caucus policy direction? You there, Gary?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Yes, thanks, Erin. Well, we would have, in terms of structure of caucus, we would have a long caucus meeting once a week, where we could discuss the policies and legislation, but also the how-to. The caucus, what we're usually bringing in is based on our promises, but the how-to is where it gets sometimes very complicated. And we wanted to make sure that the how-to was also explained and debated in caucus, in a longer caucus meeting. So we'd have one caucus meeting before question period, just to talk about what may come up, what may not come up, what we're going to say about it. People would sometimes ask questions about how we were going to answer things, but give some input on that, because obviously they became the part of the evening news. So you don't want to blindside your own team before it ends up being a clip on television. We also had caucus members in all legislation in Manitoba on second reading went to a public hearing. So we made sure caucus members that had an interest were assigned to the right meetings. And we often would come back from a public hearing, and there'd be a lot of really good ideas in the public hearing, and we would rewrite some of the legislation that we got wrong in that process. So I found the legislative public hearings really good for caucus, really good for government, and really good ultimately for the public. Unless it was just an organized, bring out 200 people to stop something. If it was constructive, they were entitled to speak, but if it was constructive, they had a lot more success in getting changes into legislation that didn't make sense. And I found caucus like that. But definitely, you don't want to have just an hour before question period be the only caucus input. You want a longer caucus meeting that can deliberate, and particularly on the how-to of implementing your promises.
Yeah, when I would respond to constituents, I would say 1 or 2 organic emails or calls to my office make up for 500 form letters that
Yes.
you might get on a certain issue. You can tell when groups are just organizing by postal code versus real grassroots feedback on legislation. Ed, any thoughts on how, when you were premier, the backbench were able to sort of impact policy development, legislation?
As Gary had mentioned, at least once a week, 3-hour caucus meeting when we're in session. But out of session, we'd have regular long caucus meetings, bring everybody in. A number of things. One idea came forward. So let's say there was an idea we should bring forward bicycle helm. Came from a caucus. Okay, it's a good idea. Let's have a discussion. Is it something we want to go ahead with? Caucus said, sure, let's investigate. So we assigned the leadership to the one caucus member that brought the idea forward. There were other ideas that came forward from caucus. They graduated driver's license. Sounded like a good idea. Okay, let's go ahead, give it full discussion, get some more research done on it, look what other jurisdictions are doing. And that involved the caucus a lot. Yes, we had the policy committee meetings on a regular basis where people could bring their ideas forward. But to get as many caucus members involved, give them the opportunity to introduce legislation in the House and sit through all the stages in the House. If it was a money bill, obviously they couldn't do that. They had to be a member of cabinet. But all of the other legislation, we tried to get individual caucus members to share the legislation through the House, and in the end, they get their name on the bill once.
All right. Well, listen, thank you. The session has been on trust and policy making in government caucus. We've been very fortunate to have three great Canadians who led their provinces and developed policy and trust through their caucuses. We are in a period of angst, of a bit of populist backlash. We see a very challenging US electoral cycle already in full swing. That I always say, when there's a wave in the US, it ripples into Canada fairly quickly too. But if we want to get great young men and women willing to step into public life and take some of the slings and arrows that come with that, let's end on a positive note where each of you get to reflect on something you're very proud of from your time as premier of your province. And I think Canada West Foundation and Gary always brings a positive aspect to public life, public service. Let's end on a positive where you can each point to something that you feel is an important part of your legacy and that would lead you to encourage someone like you who might be thinking of public life, of ignoring what's on Twitter and diving in. Perhaps start with you, Christy.
Ignoring what's on Twitter. Yeah, that's a good idea, but I won't, that's not my only one. For me, it was the work that we did on Indigenous reconciliation. And in particular, my view is very much that, and I came to this view that there is no reconciliation with First Nations if it's just apologies and commissions. It has to be economic reconciliation. We have to eliminate poverty in communities. And the only way to eliminate poverty is to create wealth in those communities, most of them rural and remote for us. So the work that we did on creating an LNG industry in British Columbia, which meant pipelines, which meant, it engaged First Nations as full participants, economic participants in the economy, and in creating, getting a piece of the pie, which they never have had, or they haven't had nearly enough of in the past, and the difference that that's made. And my view always was, look, if we have to cut the resource pie up differently so that government gets less of the money and First Nations get more of the money, well, that's okay, because we don't actually need government to get bigger, but we do need First Nations to get out of poverty. That, I think, is the thing I'm proudest of, because we look across the province, we now see First Nations radically transforming into communities that are wealthier, healthier, better education, lower incarceration rates, lower child apprehension rates. And I think that's a generational opportunity for us. We grasped it, and with the support of British Columbians, we really made real good progress there.
I'm glad you said that, Premier, because I like to think that we, with our policy development, built on some of your economic reconciliation.
Yes.
And perhaps where that election where you really fought about getting projects done and LNG and the opportunities both for First Nation and for British Columbians, I think was pretty transformative. You now see Cedar LNG, you see projects in Kitimat, in further north, all of which was kind of started under your vision. So
Yeah.
Thank you for that. But I'm really glad you chose that, because I was going to mention it myself. Maybe you next, Ed, and then we'll go to Gary for a reflection on something that you're really proud of from your time leading your province.
All of the positive things accomplished. One that really stands out in my mind is the New West Trade Agreement with Premiers Campbell and Wall. And the most memorable was to get the agreement signed on Premier Hulteen's desk. I mean, here it was a premier that had this vision of forming a large province called Buffalo, and the federal Liberal government at the time says, "No, you're not going to have it." So they divided us up, and as Premier Wall used to say, Saskatchewan, easy to draw but very difficult to spell. And that to me was just something that we talked about in the Confederation, and Gary was there for all those meetings. never agree on freer trade within our own country. So that to me was an accomplishment.
For sure.
Oh, you should be very proud of that. And that came up when we had the Supreme Court decision in the Comeau case where, a guy was fined for bringing beer from Quebec to New Brunswick. You showed that some of these century-old attitudes could be pushed over if you get premiers showing some vision for the country and really showing where the country should be taking the lead from the New West approach that you brought. Free the Grape out of BC, as you'll remember, Christy, from the Okanagan. So these are pretty big positives to point out, Gary. Can you rise to the occasion and point to something from your legacy that you're very proud of and that would encourage and inspire people to get into public life despite all the challenges today?
Well, it's a wonderful career, public life, notwithstanding some of the media slings and arrows, and in social media now, it's just tougher for people, no question about it. But when you're concerned about something and want to do something about it, get elected, put your name on the ballot, run, and enjoy it. I would say one of the areas that I'm proud about is our caucus and our cabinet look like the people of Manitoba. We had 2 Cree cabinet ministers, we had an Inuit speaker, we had Métis people in our cabinet, and then we had the ability then to appoint more women to cabinet. We were not quite at 50%. I was hoping to beat other premiers. I didn't beat them all to 50%, but we then also looked at the family court, and slowly over 10 years, we were able to, we didn't do it right away, but we now have a family court of 50% women judges. And I think that that's really important with all the decisions they have to make. A lot of the infrastructure is more public and more pronounced. So I was happy to work with Prime Minister Harper on the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Very controversial, people opposed to it until it opens. And we had a hockey team that left Winnipeg, and I got the opportunity with Mark Chipman and David Thompson to build a new arena in downtown Winnipeg. And I called it the Nitpickers Convention. So I had protesters every day protesting, giving some public. It was 2/3 private money, 1/3 public. 1/3 was mostly from the province. I got flack every day on that. People running, they voted against it. My opponents, the Conservatives, voted against the arena. I still have every one of their names of who voted against it. That's the good thing about Hansard. And but now we got a hockey team back. We're contending with great teams across Canada right now in the All-Star break. And when I go to a hockey game, I don't buy a beer because people remember we got the flack for building it, but we sure get the cold beer when we watch a great hockey game. So that was kind of an history. I call it the Nitpickers Convention with the media. Nitpicking this, nitpicking that, and then at the end of the day, people are happy we did it. Not just for hockey, but for concerts and all kinds of other sports and entertainment. But it was a lot of flack.
What a very Canadian way to end by using a hockey. I lived in Winnipeg, Premier, in '96 when the team left for the first time, and I was getting my wings at the airbase, and it was like a stomach punch for the city of Winnipeg, a great city. So it's great to see it back. The team's doing well. I think it could be the next big hope for a Canadian Stanley Cup. But time will tell. But it also must be, you talked about the diversity you brought to your caucus and cabinet. There must be a bit of pride that you have now having Premier Canoe, the First Nation Premier of Manitoba and in Canada. So I think some of your legacies are still having a lot of impact years after you left office. And anybody that is thinking of public life, look at the impact made by these great Canadians and think of the Teddy Roosevelt poem, The Arena. It's not the critic who counts. It's the person that's striving valiantly, covered in mud, sometimes a bit of blood, sweat, and tears, but doing the best for their province and for their country. I think that's a great way to leave it. I'm not sure if Gary's going to come on and share with us one of his positive memories from public life, but I want to thank each of you for being a part of this great discussion on how we can build trust in our institutions, in our provincial and federal governments, and keep building a great country that I think Canada is and can continue to be.